the idea here, for those of you who don't know, I don't want to spoil the story, but I don't because I don't really watch that. Its idea is that the government started to decide, it's US, I think they decide that they're going to make 24 hours period of time, day called a purge in their policy, system and policy, where when you can do anything. There's no laws, you can do anything and you can get away with it, basically, right? To basically let go this people's urge, kind of oppressed feelings of doing something deviant and sometimes violent. And they do that, in this movie. And what happened is that some people started to, invade homes and try to kill, actually. Now, and there's more to that story. Apparently, it's very popular. This is a great example of normlessness, right? There's a norm that you shouldn't be doing certain things, such as, for example, of course, killing. And there's a strict law around that. But if you take that out, right, once viable social norms and regulation no longer work for a period, at least certain period of time, what's going to happen? This could happen, the purge and killings. I'm scared about this kind of movie rather than something like a Ghost, because I am scared to know what's going to happen if we are to actually do this. Do we gonna have this enemy state and really have this issue? A lot of killing, for example, which, can be considered as deviant leisure, like we discussed earlier in this chapter. Now, there are some, this is hypothetical, right? It's a movie, but there are some real world example in certain extreme life events, situation, crisis, which I typically talk about. But I thought, this year we should talk about COVID because, we are in the crisis right now, pandemic. So I wanted to ask you, what about COVID? What types of, possibly deviant behavior did you observe possibly? Or maybe you can look it up quickly on Google. And what kind of normlessness do you think is associated with it? What norms disappeared because of maybe COVID, social distancing, or unemployment, or whatever that might be related to it, caused that potentially deviant behavior. What do you think? Have you seen any? Second explanation is leisure boredom, which is basically the perception that leisure is meaningless, right? That doesn't satisfy your need to for optimal arousal, specifically get your arousal level high enough. You're bored, and not just bored during leisure time, but also you're repeatedly, as a pattern, you're bored, right? Chapter tried to connect that with their enemy, but again, this is not true. Sorry, this is not true. This chapter is wrong. These concepts are not necessarily tied together. However, leisure boredom is associated with the substance use. When you're bored, when you have a strong leisure boredom pattern, you tend to use substance. We know that based on the fact as well. So there's that link with their leisure boredom as an explanation for substance use. Another theory is what is called a differential association. What that means is basically things are learned. Delinquent behavior is learned through interaction with others, right? If a person's social groups, especially peers, are, have delinquent norms and delinquent behaviors, that can be learned to other members. Think about the example of peer pressure in a way, cigarette drinking, when you're youth, like there's that group of people who do that. And when you wanted to belong to that group, you would probably have to do that. You learn that. Now, related to that, chapter mentioned this study by Sadowska and her colleagues. And this is actually, these are the people who I learned with when I was doing master's degree at University of Illinois. And this person, Monica Sadowska, she's my mentor, one of the mentors, researchers. And she's this interesting person, Polish immigrant, and she did a PhD here at the U of A, actually, Canada, and they went to the States. And she's this, not that tall person with the blonde hair, but she goes to sometimes, one of the most dangerous areas in an inner city, Chicago, and try to interview gang members. Yes, it's crazy stuff. Sometimes leisure research can be very, very exciting and thrilling. So according to their study, what they found was that the leisure behavior among gang members that's revolved around included a lot of house party that involved drug use, alcohol use, sex, hanging around together on the street corners, violence against opposing gangs. Gangs are like teams, and there's a rivalries, right? And they retaliate each other, and vandalism. So there's a lot of deviant leisure activity kind of involved in this gang. Now, gang is a really good example of differential association, according to their study. Now, they did an interview with the former gang member, and one of the interview quote from female former gang members really stood out. I thought really good example of differential association. So she said, hanging around in a neighborhood, crushing our cars into their, as in opposing gangs' cars, stuff like that. She was raised in it. That's all she knew. When she was younger, it was fun to steal cars and go to other neighborhoods to other gangbangers, like where gang members get together, and crush them up. As in, sometimes using, well, a lot of times actually using violence and using guns, and there's a killing as well. So really the important part is she was raised in it. That's all she knew. If that's all she knew, she would of course learn that differential association, right? Retreatism is the last theory that the chapter talk about. It means that some of the taboo recreation, deviant leisure, is a lifestyle that kind of pulls away an individual from the dominant social norms as a matter of personal expression. So how that works is that when people don't subscribe to culturally valued goals, cultural norms, don't follow them, there's a tension, there's a strain that leads to different lifestyle, which sometimes physically and socially separate them from the rest of the society, okay? Chapter, for example, talk about college students who give up on their grades and retreat to just play video games and party. And it makes sense, but I don't know if it's a great example. Because, I mean, playing video games and partying are pretty common, right? It could be considered as a deviant, of course, against the norm, right? But I think it may be an even better example could be some of the artists. Some of the artists literally, physically separate themselves. They go to the woods, or they almost lock them up in their certain room, and they don't come out really, right? Socially isolated too. And they focus on their work. And it's as a matter of personal expression too, right? A lot of artwork. And they even die after, while having that type of lifestyle. This is a picture of Van Gogh. Van Gogh's work. Van Gogh, I guess it's more a better pronunciation, I don't know. But, well, Van Gogh did this kind of isolated life, had an isolated life. According to his biography, also, although he is also known to having had some mental health issues, so what was the reason here is really difficult to pinpoint, but it could be an example of the retreatism to an extent as well. And, having an artistic career is not necessarily culturally valued goals to begin. So really pursuing that can create a lot of strain and gap, tension, which could drive them to retreatism. Now, those are the things that the chapter talked about, right? And I don't really, they're important theories, but I think that they still sometimes caricature the deviantness, how sort of like different these deviant taboo recreation leisure behaviors are against norms. But again, going back to the first video and the first part, I wanted to emphasize that deviance is really common to an extent. And I want to introduce my example, my study. I did a small study back in 2016 and 15. What I studied was on this right side of the picture. It's called Boys Love, or BL in Japan. It's a pop culture, right? Novels, light novels, cartoons and comics, very popular in Japan. The central theme here is the male-to-male character, relationship, including sometimes very sexual depiction as well. So gay relationship, basically. The trick keeper, so that's where the boys' love is coming from, the name. Now, what's tricky is that it's often produced by female, like female drawers and, writers and all that, and consumed by majority of them consumers are female, vast majority. Right, now it gets like a little confusing in people's mind because with the theme and it just doesn't match up. And then also we have some study and surveys that shows that many of those people who create, produce, and consumes those females are also straight, like heterosexual in a real life. So it really gets confusing. Now, what is going on? And also, this is not a niche pop culture in Japan. This is a at least hundreds of $1 million industry. Yes. And if you go to any typical like a bookstore, like here in Edmonton, we have a chapters, right? Like a chapters, you walk in, there's shelf, at least a shelf or shelves, multiple, that are dedicated to the this genre. That level of popularity. Think about that, right? So I really, when it came out, I started up like even back in 20th century, but more so in early 21st century. And I was like, I really wanted to understand like why people, especially those female fans, wanted to consume that. I did an interview with some of the fans actually. And one of the major reasons that I could pinpoint was this, what I ended up calling emotional survival, which is not really surprising. And I think you can actually agree with this. You can see this thing in your life. It's about fantasy or deviance from the norms as a way, and consuming it and putting yourself in it, right? By reading comics or watching cartoons as a way to emotionally heal yourself after emotionally worn out by living daily life that's stressful. That way people can cope with the daily stress and get back to their normal life. Some of the people I talked to were, for example, had a very successful, normatively speaking, professional career, like a professor, a researcher, a lawyer, for example. Some of them had a very successful family. I mean, traditional notion of family, married, had children, for example, or in just heterosexual relationship right now. And yet they enjoy this boys' love because those daily life came with something like, for example, very workaholic norm, which exhausted them physically, but more so emotionally. Pressure from parents to get married, for example, or the tension with their interpersonal relationship can be stressful often, right? That. So really, to survive that and have that emotional energy recharged, they enjoy this fantasy. And they knew that was fantasy. I mean, look at the picture. I mean, it's always really beautified. The gay relationship was beautified, romanticized, and these female consumers knew that it was fantasy. It was not real. However, that was actually good for them because they can put themselves into this fantasy world and get out and go live their normal life, daily life, real life, with their, stress coped out, basically. Now, I want you to think about maybe you do similar things, not necessarily Boys Lab, of course, and Boys Lab actually is internationally famous too right now, but something like just maybe exercise, watching, kind of fun TV show, comedy TV show, playing video games. Maybe you do different, you have a different mechanism, different ways to get this emotional survival. But even though on a surface level, one type of activity, for example, exercise, isn't considered as a deviant, right? For the most, to the most degree. The other side, for example, Boys Lab, is considered to be actually pretty deviant, even in Japan too. Now, if you dig deeper, the common cause, the intention, and reason could be this, for example, something like emotional survival that a lot of us can share and agree with each other, really, that we need. It's just the manifestation is different. And for example, well, again, Boys Lab is very internationally popular right now, and especially in East Asia, Southeast Asia area, but also in Europe and North America, you can find some of those. And if you think about example, 50 Shades of Grey, right? That can be also considered as a fantasy, that erotica and movies and TV shows based off of that, we enjoyed. Same reason, maybe. So for you to get a better idea of what Boys Lab, there's a short video with English, and it's not about comics and cartoons. This one actually is about cafe. So in Japan, there's so many themed cafe, which is not just about hanging with the kitties and cats and animals, but sometimes it's about, for example, Boys Lab, where male waiters do some role play related to this genre of Boys Love. Mostly female consumers, clientele come here and enjoy that. And you can see, hopefully, in this video, the fantasy, the emotional survival aspect of it too. So now this is the conclusion of this chapter 10, and I hope you enjoyed it. But the point that I really want to highlight is that the deviant leisure is more common than we think it is. And especially when you dig down, not just the surface activity level, but dig down to the reasons behind it. It can be something that anyone, really, all of us can agree upon. Yes, we all need, for example, emotional survival and resonate with each other. So that level of understanding is very, very important. And moreover, what's deviant, changes over time and across groups. And that understanding that, deviant leisure is more common, especially the reasons behind it, is very important because still people who do engage in deviant leisure face a lot of what D.J. Williams called leisure discrimination, which is basically discrimination based on abnormal, leisure practices that people consider abnormal, deviant, or taboo, right? For example, the video about Boys Love talk about the group of female who love Boys Love are actually called in a very certain way. Actually, it's in Japanese called fujoshi, which means rotten women, rotten girls, which has negative connotation. You can see rotten, literally, right? There is a discrimination stereotyping around that too. The assumption here is that people stereotype those people that, oh, they should be consuming that type of genre of leisure because they're, for example, not successful in their real world relationship, which obviously is not necessarily the case according to my study. So that discrimination, stereotyping, so many issues could happen around deviant leisure. And I think if people like you learn about leisure, learn about deviant leisure, and understand that it's actually more common and something that we can really understand and agree upon, then maybe our society can become more kind to different leisure expressions. And I think I will leave it to that. And this is the end of chapter 10, and I hope you enjoyed it. Bye now.